Live? All right, we are live.
Cool.
All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to Transient Canvas. Welcome to the Charlotte New Music Festival. Amy Advocat and Matt Sharak, and I hope I said your names right. Sharak. Of Transient Canvas on bass, clarinet, and marimba. So I'll let you have the stage now.
Wonderful. Hello.
So, yeah, Elizabeth, thanks for having us. This is really great. Thanks for this this is all still happening, which is really cool. I hope everyone's doing well wherever you are. So for our class, we're just going to talk a little bit about, writing for each of our individual instruments. And then we'll open it up to any kind of questions you all have. And those questions can be about anything, really. It can be about, of course, what we've talked about in the class. But we're also happy to answer any questions you have about, art, the music world, what we're all doing over the next year, stuff like that. We're happy to answer anything. But just to kick the class off, so we're going to play a piece for you that we think demonstrates our ensemble pretty well, but that doesn't utilize any extended techniques. If any of you have actually gone to our website, or if any of you have followed us or seen us perform in the past, you know that we play a lot of pieces that, get into a lot of extended techniques, a lot of strange sound worlds, and we love doing that. But if we're talking about specifically writing for the clarinet/bass clarinet and writing for the marimba, we figured the best place to start was with a piece that let those instruments just be what they are, but do so really effectively. So this is a fun piece called Lumba Lumba Hijau by Matthew Welsh. And it's, in Matt's words, this combines Eric Dolphy with Balinese gamelan. So here we go. Okay.
Yay! Can feel the applause. Oh, stop!
Yeah, hopefully that all came through through Zoom. Yeah, so that piece is, we like showing composers that piece because it kind of falls under the tropes of what you think of for marimba music. Like, it's groovy, the bass clarinet's all groovy, but at the same time, like, he takes our instruments and he stretches our ranges out a bunch, so it creates a much larger, it feels like a larger instrument than just like groovy marimba sounds and groovy clarinet sounds, if that makes sense. And I lied, there is an extended technique. So
I know, I realized while I was playing that we lied. Oops, well, we'll get into that.
Oh well. Yeah, so I think the best way to start the class is to start off with Amy talking about the bass clarinet and the clarinet.
I do
all
have
that
my
stuff.
clarinet with me.
So,
And let's screen share so everyone can see my handout, which we will make sure everyone receives a copy of at some point during this week, so you guys
you're
can
going to
all...
want to turn your iPad sideways.
Really? Good to know.
It'll be a bigger...
Wonderful. I will.
Do you have your pencil? Do you need it?
I have it.
Okay, good.
Great.
And throughout our whole class, definitely, if you don't have to necessarily wait for us to stop talking before you ask questions. If you're like, I need to ask this right now, like, don't be shy. Unmute yourself and be like, wait a second.
Well, okay. Maybe not just because, okay. But yeah,
Yeah.
Feel free. I don't want to lose people, but I also don't want to skip something if someone is really like itching to know a specific thing about every topic. Okay, so let's just jump right in. Again, I'll make sure you all have a copy of this at some point this week. So this is my handout. What we're going to talk about is a lot about some of the extended techniques of the instrument, but I first want to touch on just kind of the basics of the way the instrument works in terms of its range and timbre. So here is the range of the instrument, and you'll notice that this top line here is the written pitch. That's going to be what I will see in your finished score, but the sounding pitch is probably what you'll be looking at when you're working with the score. Please note that me and probably, I can't speak for everyone, but I will say uniformly, it's become standardized that treble clef is used for bass clarinet. It may look really, really nuts in the first note. You see this really low, really lots of ledger line situation, but trust me on this, that we're all really used to reading those ledger lines, and it just keeps everything really easy for us to read.
But Amy, what if my composition teacher tells me to study Richard Strauss scores to figure out how to write for the bass clarinet?
Oh, I see. We're doing the Heckle version of the class. You got it. Thank you for that. Yeah, so this has become more standardized recently, and Matt brings up a good point that historically, if you go through some of those orchestral parts for bass clarinet, you'll see a lot of bass clef in some of those pieces, especially like he said with Strauss. It's true with Wagner. But you also see bass clarinet written in A, which means we're transposing. You also sometimes see the use of the bass clef and the treble clef in a totally different way, where the treble clef will actually be written in a different octave than we're used to playing, and we have to transpose. None of that is standard anymore, and what you see here in my handout is actually going to be standard, where we read the treble clef. And personally, this is at least just for me, I don't like to see 8VB, I don't like to see 8VA. I love to read the ledger lines. Nuts. Matt's covering my screen, but he's probably not covering yours.
We have a question. Do you prefer a C with the low 8VA or ledger lines?
And I did, exactly, and I just said that, absolutely. To reiterate with the chat, thank you for that question. I really don't like to see octave displacement written in with 8VA or 8VB. I really like to see the ledger lines. That's my personal taste, but I do think that it's standardized. If you think about the history of the instrument and the way that we learn the instrument, when we play clarinet, our lowest note is an E. I'm just going to hold it up because I do have it in case anyone wants to hear demonstrations on that. Our lowest note is only a third written note higher, a major third higher than the written pitch that you see here for the lowest note, that low E. So we're already used to reading several ledger lines when we play. So there's absolutely no reason not to keep going. Keep it all simple. Okay.
But when you say it's your personal preference, do you mean like for woodwind players they would prefer this? Or
I can't speak for everyone, but I will say that it's very unlikely that I'll see a bass clarinet part that has any 8VA or 8VB in it, and I think that's because most of us prefer to see it with just the pitches written.
Okay.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't also know, Amy is the bass clarinetist and
Oh, I
second
didn't introduce
clarinetist
myself.
for Boston Modern Orchestra Project, BMOP. BMOP has been around for 20 years, and they are an orchestra that records music of the 20th and 21st century. So Amy's and had to read a lot of orchestral music, especially.
Yeah, and I play a lot of new music. I've worked with a lot of well-known composers. I've worked with a lot of young composers. So any information that I give you, just know that it's coming from a lot of experience behind it. But
And a lot of in the section in a recording session, being like, "Hey, can you believe what this person wrote?"
that's not what I do.
That's
Anyway,
not what you do. But...
don't you dare put thing in my mouth.
Oh, okay.
All right, so let me just demonstrate. So you'll see that I've actually separated out my entire range, which is from a low C written to a high C written, into 4 different categories. That's because actually we think of these kinds of registers of the instrument in 4 different ways. We have the Chalumeau instrument, which is a historical term coming from the instrument that actually was more recorder-like back in the day in the early clarinet history and didn't have a register key, so it only played in the bottom note, the bottom range. The Chalumeau register is known for its really rich quality, and of course, if you think of the bass clarinet, and low notes really go hand in hand. You really want to include some of those rich, deep notes. And I'll just demonstrate them. So it's just got this really meaty, I love that sound. And it always makes me sad if I get a bass clarinet piece and someone accidentally didn't write for that register, because that's kind of what it's for. The bass clarinet is a bass instrument, so don't forget about it. But also what I see a lot in music when we're working with some emerging composers, or people who think that the throat tones are going to be a great place to play a melodic line or lyrical line. If you're holding some of these notes out, you might notice they're different colors. So whereas I had a lot of rich color in the bottom register, something like this written B flat in the middle of the staff, it's very thin. It's probably the worst note in our instrument. So for me, if I'm getting this lush, lyrical thing, and I have to hold something like that note for a good amount of time, it's not a satisfying sound. But it can be played with also for its thinner quality. If that's a sound that you're going for, then awesome area of the instrument to go into. It's just not as rich, it's not as vibrant. So that's the throat tone area. Clarion also comes from a historical instrument term, kind of like a little trumpet. It is referring to this bell-like quality. Again, a very ringing quality. Beautiful part of the instrument. And then my favorite register is the altissimo register. This for me is where the bass clarinet really says, take it aside, clarinet, I can do that too. Plays really high, has this really beautiful lush sound. I hope I don't mess it up now. And I mean, the bass clarinet can go up quite high. I can play higher than that. I dare not right now. But I've given you guys a very comfortable range. You can see right away, 4 octaves. Oh my gosh. I mean, it's actually more than the clarinet. So I hate to say that I'm biased, but I do think the bass clarinet has a lot going for it. Has a bigger range. It has so much variety in the colors, and I hope you could see that in these different areas of the instrument.
So one person did ask if it's always written a step higher than sounding.
Absolutely good question, and let me just reiterate that for all of you, is that the bass clarinet actually sounds an eighth, or an octave plus a step, not an eighth, a ninth, blah. The bass clarinet sounds an octave and a step higher than the sounding pitch, but we always write it a step higher. Wait, what did we say? What was the question? Is this just a basic transposition question?
Yeah, I responded to the text, but I want to make sure that in case anyone's listening.
Thank you.
You write bass clarinet.
You have to write the bass clarinet in. So this specific graph, if you're confused, please refer to this graph. You'll see right above the notes that I wrote in sounding pitch, the written pitch, that's what it's supposed to look like. So the bass clarinet and the clarinet are both transposing instruments. So you're going to want to make sure that the part shows a different note from the sounding.
But basically, a bass clarinet sounds an octave lower than a regular.
It does. So when I'm reading the written pitch, it is in fact going to sound lower than it looks. But that is specifically because you don't want the clarinets to have to relearn different fingerings for what they see on the staff. It's just what we're used to. This is also true for like contrabass clarinet. I'm going to look at the pretty much the exact same pitches that I'm looking at here, except it will sound 2 octaves lower. So it's just so that it's standardized, so we don't have to constantly relearn fingerings for what we're seeing on the page. But yeah, that's the kind of work that you guys do behind the scene, and then we get to play something without having to overthink it.
Of course, this is different on the A clarinet and the E flat clarinet. But that's...
Well, we're not talking about that. Why would you bring that into this? Great, so I just wanted to cover like that. That's kind of like the basics. And for those of you who are new to writing for bass clarinet, this is a great chart for you guys to refer to make sure that you're turning in a part that is correctly transposed and looks clean. Any other quick questions about the basics?
Let's see. Would you say that the throat tones of the bass clarinet are meeker than the standard clarinet?
Yeah, and it's a really great question, and I'm happy to demonstrate. So I actually really don't like that B flat. And if you take this exact same written pitch, and if I play that B flat, so that'll be the same fingering, on the clarinet, it'll sound an octave higher now. It still is the worst note on the instrument. So, that's my shallow, but here's the throat tone. Right? That's me just like not really doing anything to it. Us clarinet players have to work really hard to try to make all these notes balance, but that B flat is just mean. It's just the weakest note of all of them.
But
honestly.
do you feel it's the question was is it worse on the bass clarinet than the clarinet?
I don't know. That sounds pretty bad. And let's see. I think it's probably going to have more body on the bass clarinet. What also sounds like I put it down and let water go into my reed. I do think the bass clarinet has a little bit more body to it, so that kind of counteracts the issue a little bit. I don't know if that answers your question.
And then someone else asked, Hayden asked, what are some clarinet and bass clarinet idioms that you really enjoy playing and which composers utilized more often?
Idioms.
Or do you want us to get further into this?
Let's get further into it. That might actually get covered here, and then we'll come back to it. Great, so I cover a lot of detail here in the page, but you can read that on your own. So let's go straight to the break. The break is good to know about because when you're writing trills and if you're writing really fast passages, you kind of want to know where this is. What is the break? The break is the area of the clarinet where I basically am going up, and each time I go up, I raise a finger, I raise a finger, I raise a finger. I've run out of fingers and I have to then go to the next register, putting all my fingers down again with the register key open. And the distance between those, or the interval between those two notes, written here, written B flat, to written B, so that's the top note of my throat register, to the bottom note of the clarinet register, that's where we refer to as the break. So, because I've been playing clarinet for a very long time, I can do that very smoothly. However, you want to be aware of it because if I'm going up and down in a passage over that interval a lot in a fast passage, that might be really awkward. Right? If I'm just doing like a note passage like this, it's a lot harder than if I were going. Those top two notes are the break interval. It just sounds sluggish. There's not much I can do about it because that's the instrument. Of course, it's heightened because this thing is bigger than the clarinet and it has a lot more key work that is kind of slower and kind of bigger and just heavier and takes longer. You know, that same passage on the clarinet might actually sound a lot easier, I think. Right? Because there's not a lot to fight against because most of the keys on the clarinet are actually open holes right into the instrument. The bass clarinet, has all these metal caps, plateau keys that cover the instrument and push other buttons while I'm moving my fingers for me because I just simply can't move my hand that big. So because of that, is it not loud enough?
No, you're good. You might want. You have like notifications popping up. Okay.
If I turn off the Wi-Fi, will I still be able to?
No.
No, then I can't do anything about it. Is there performance mode? Sorry, guys. I've never done that before. Do you know how to do that? Everywhere. If I get an email political, I apologize for that. Okay, I forgot what I was talking about. Thank you.
Thanks.
That's okay. Anyway, all that is to say that the break is sluggish, and it's more sluggish on the bass clarinet. But the good news is that if you're writing trills, we do have key work that allows us to go over the break quickly. It's just not ideal in a passage like the one I played, but in a trill, it can be done.
So Anthony Lai asks, is it only awkward specifically between those two notes or any jump over that spot?
Thank you for asking that. And I do write that here, and I should reiterate, that's just the interval where the break begins. But it's true that if you're writing a note below the B flat and a note above the B, generally within a second around those notes, maybe a little larger, you're still dealing with the same problem. Yeah.
And another question from Justin Schwartz. Are trill fingerings in the throat tone register more sluggish than they are on the soprano clarinet?
In general, key work on the bass clarinet is going to be more sluggish, but this is particularly because of the break we're talking about. It's extra sluggish. So trills, if you notice here in my handout, any trill, minor or major second, is possible on both instruments. I just want to make sure that that's clear. They're all pretty much possible, even over the break. But when you're dealing with intervals of larger than a second over the break, that's when my trill keys are often not going to be usable, and then you have like a really clunky situation. For example, if I take the A second space to the C sharp third space, that goes over the break because it's falling around those notes that I've written here, but it's also a major third, so it's not going to utilize the trill keys. It's about as fast as I can play it cleanly, I guess. I mean, that's a cool sound if you're going for something that's kind of obscured, but I can't play it clean. So it's just good to know where the break is for that reason, I think, especially for trills and for fast passages. If I'm playing like a nice passage, a legato, of course I can go over the break very smoothly. That's my job. But I just want you guys to be able to pinpoint the spot in the instrument where if you write something very fast, you might lose a friend. Great. So long as I've covered the questions about that, I'll move forward.
Yes.
Great. So the clarinet and the bass clarinet both work really awesome. Like big leaps are possible because unlike the flute or the oboe, and I don't want to speak to what they can do, but in terms of the way the instrument is designed, when they jump the register, they're jumping an octave. When we jump a register, we jump a perfect 12th. It's just the way the instrument is designed acoustically. So what that means is that if with the flick of just my thumb, I'm moving a perfect 12th. So the range and the jumping that I can do on the instrument is really flexible, but everyone should know, and the reason that I have this in the handout is that leaping upward is actually quite easy, but leaping downward is very difficult. In fact, if I just hit this back key, which is my register key, that leaps me upward, if I were to then take it off, my instrument actually would not come back down. But it takes a really long time for my instrument to come down. I actually took the key off several seconds before you even heard the instrument attempt to come back down. So the reason I mention this all is because if you're having me do lots of leaping downward, don't include a slur on those intervals because I'm probably going to tongue it anyway, right? I can go back down really easily when I articulate because that gives me a chance to take the key off and kind of reset. Yeah, great. That's all I got to say about that, unless there are questions.
Okay, so never knew.
Yay!
There we go.
Great.
Awesome.
Glad to learn something every day. All right, so that's pretty much it. Like I said, with regard to like the normal writing of just general range, timbre, and just like pitch questions that you might have. So we're going to kind of take a small dip into the extended technique pool. I'm going to try not to go too long on this. I could talk about this for a very long time, but I kind of give you guys a brief overview of the things that I like to do on the instrument. Anything else you want to know about, I'm happy to answer your questions later. There seems to already be a question.
No, Lansing wrote, I was also today years old when I learned that.
Oh, cool. There you go, Lansing. If you want to redo anything in the opera, just let me know. All right, so microtones. I'm just going to pass through microtones really quick. You could dive into microtones for a year if you wanted to. I mean, there's just so much going on in between the notes. But for those of you who are new to it, here are some like standardized notations for the quarter tones that I like to see, at least. Basically, it's possible to do pretty much any quarter tone on both instruments. There are a couple that are impossible, but that's why you'll go to your resources. And I have a list of resources at the end of this handout where you can kind of go in and actually look at the different fingerings and see, oh, that one's wrong, you can't do that one. And just so you know. And make sure that when you transpose your part, that you then check to make sure that you didn't write anything impossible. That often is forgotten. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the bass clarinet has all these plateau keys, which means that it's less flexible. Even though I'm really biased, I love this instrument. It is in fact less flexible with regard to the notes in between the 12 notes that we're used to using. So if you're writing something with, for example, 72 notes per octave, I've done that on this instrument, but man, it wasn't as in tune as it was on my clarinet. And for those of you who are really excited about tuning systems, I did record a concerto by Ezra Sims with 72 notes per octave with Bemop, which I hope is somehow still accessible somewhere if you guys want to take a listen.
Yeah, it's on Bemop Radio.
Bemop Radio, exactly. So take a listen. It's kind of creepy sounding. I love it.
Well, can't you just lip it?
So, I mean, you ask a good question, and lipping things can be done. The problem with lipping things that I have is if you're really playing a passage with a lot of notes, you really don't want to be, I mean, I think flute players can do it. I don't want to speak to what they can do, but you do see them kind of move their head a lot. I think they can do that quicker than we can. With the reed and with everything else that's going on, I can't really be bending notes in a string of like 16th notes. So I am really relying heavily on my fingers to do that job. That being said, if I'm holding a note, yes, I can definitely bend it here and there to tune it. So that's pretty much it with that. I think, again, if you have specific questions about microtones, there are some resources that I include at the end of my handout, and you can really take a deep dive because there's a lot to do. Great. I just want to get into sounds. That's kind of my thing. I love to play with colors with all the composers that we work with. And here are some examples, I guess. We'll just kind of plow through. So timbre trills, or bisbigliando, I said it correctly, I think. Maybe not. I have trouble with that word. Or color fingerings. All of these are very similar. The timbre trill is exactly the same as the bisbigliando. And color fingerings are basically when you do those. Well, let me talk about this first. So what's a timbre trill? Let's start there, just in case you don't know. If I'm playing a note, and then I add a slightly detuned same note, and then I trill between the two. So in the case of this note, I'm going to add a different fingering for that to make it more colorful. What I'm actually doing, though, to be clear, is I think a lot of books define this as playing one fingering and then playing another fingering for the same note. I'm not really doing that because a lot of the notes here can only be played one way. And even if they can be played a different way, they don't sound that different sometimes. So what I'm really doing is I'm shading the note with a microtonal fingering, right? I'm playing like an eighth tone or a sixth tone, lower or higher, to make that trill. And that's in that passage there in the example, what I just played. So they're not all the same distance, but they have this really ethereal quality. They have this really, kind of detuned quality to them. There's nothing very specific about that, and you can see in this example that the composer just writes timbre trill, and I take care of the work of figuring out, like, how am I going to do that? And as a contrast, in measure 17 of this example, you'll see that those are quarter tones. So at the beginning, right, I just played the opening measures gesture. Those are quarter tones. Do they sound that different from timbre trill? Kind of, but just so you know, you can do either or.
So, Hayden never realized that timbre trills were intonation based, so that's cool. Anthony asks, is this standard enough to just notate quote unquote timbre trill, or should you write out the first one?
So the example that I show you here, that is not what the composer was intending to do. The composer really wants me to play a quarter tone trill in 17 and then in 18 and on to do any timbre trill that I want. And it should be noted that this composer is also a really wonderful flute player, so he already knows that I'm probably going to just do like very small gradations of tunings for the timbre trill. But for the quarter tones, he wants it to be the wider, a really wide quarter tone trill.
And then another question from Edward is, are timbre trills possible on all notes in the bass clarinet, or are there also exceptions like with certain quarter tones?
I believe that they're possible on all of the notes, but when I'm in the bottom of my range, I typically can't do any color fingerings at all. Basically, written low G, I believe, I'll say low. So if I look back at the chart, let me just do that because it's easier to visualize. That I think, just speaking completely out of turn here, that this note here, written, is the lowest note that I can do any color fingerings on at all. Because after that, all of the fingers that are going to be hitting these longer pinky keys, and I just can't, there's not much I can do. There might be an exception that I'm forgetting right now, but in general, stay within that note is the lowest note that I would write down for color trills. But other than that, I do think that I could be forgetting, but I think that everything's possible. Yeah. And that's also the same, by the way, for clarinet. Same written note. That's like the highest note that I would write. Great. Yay, multiphonics. I'm not going to cover that right now, the vario. Okay, I'm skipping it. So multiphonics, if you're not aware of, but I think a lot of us have heard this before, is when I trick my instrument to play multiple notes at once. And the way that I do that, and we spoke briefly about the register key mechanic, right? If I hit that back key, my instrument leaps up a 12th, hooray. But sometimes if I hit a different key that is above the bottom fingering that I'm using, it will trick my instrument by making it want to jump up to the next register, but also it's not designed to do it, so it kind of plays multiple things at once. So it's just a really cool sound. It's a great, I think, mechanism for if you're writing something that you want to like have like maybe an electronic feel to it or a gritty feel to it, but really there's a lot of variety in the multiphonic like spectrum of fingering possibilities. So like some of them can be really soft and quite ethereal and beautiful. Some of them can be like really in your face and just really explosive. And all of that has actually been studied. So that, again, at the back of my handout is a resource. Go for it. Dive in and like listen to all the different kinds of multiphonics there are. But please note, and you'll see that here in my example, that when you've done your research and you have found multiphonic fingerings that you love, you got to put them in the score. I don't know them all. It's an incredible amount to memorize. So it's not been done. We don't really memorize them. I have favorites, but I certainly don't have them all in my head.
And they're kind of personal, right? Like they should
They
also...
are, and it's another thing that I was going to say actually is like you'll see this example here that I have in the score. The composer and I worked a lot together to make this piece possible, and it's a really great piece if you want to listen to multiphonics. Jump in and listen to it. It's called Density is a Kind of Love. It's actually on our website, and it's actually written for marimba, bass clarinet, and bassoon. And what the composer did was combine the bassoon and bass clarinet multiphonics in a way that it sounds like a chorale. And it just sounds so beautiful, but it took a lot of experimentation individually, and then also the bassoonist and I got together. The composer actually spectrally analyzed our multiphonics and then made them fit together in a way that sounds like chords. But even if you find a fingering in a book, it doesn't mean that what I do is going to sound exactly like what you heard. Everyone has a different anatomy, and so the way that I play might not be exactly the same as the way someone else plays. But also, in the case of the multiphonic that I played, well, maybe that wasn't a good example. Let me try and find better.
Someone's calling you.
Sorry, it's my first Zoom class. So I'm not really moving my fingers. I just wanted to show you guys. I could have probably found a better example. But basically, I was playing the same fingering, and I'm able to locate different zones in within that multiphonic fingering, so that it always sounds very different until you give me one really important piece of information: the notes that you want to hear. They have to be written just like you see here. Now, because Scott, the composer, did this spectral analysis, he knew that all those notes were going to be there. But actually, the only note I really need is the top note, maybe the top couple notes if you happen to know them and you want to show. But I need to know, where am I aiming? Because on the instrument, if I just play a note and no register key and no nothing, I don't change anything. Right, so I can play pretty much all the different partials that the instrument will overblow without touching a button. So I need to know what area, what partial of the harmonic system am I going to be aiming for to get the notes that you desire. Okay, are there questions regarding multiphonics?
Okay, so there are some questions. One recommendation is it cool if we turn off your sharing unless you're using the handout, like in the setting you see it? Just 'cause
Yeah.
we look
How do you
small?
do performance mode?
No. I can do that here. I mean, like, don't worry about it.
Oh, because they can't see me.
Yes.
Oh,
So
yeah.
let me just do that.
Sorry.
But
I don't have power of the computer. The computer is handled by the other of
yeah,
us.
I'm sorry. That's my
Hi.
bad. But aside from that, let's see. Going back, there was one timbre twirl question.
Great.
Which was, is there such a thing as an extra low F key on bass clarinet,
Ooh.
like on the high-end buffet crampon soprano clarinets?
Yes, I think I know what you're talking about.
And would
the
that allow for
Tosca
lower
key.
color trills?
I don't know. So I play Selmer, first of all, which I love. I think Selmers are the best. I know what you're talking about. I'm not even sure I know if that would work on the clarinet because I've never used that key. But to be sure, I don't have that on the instrument, and I guess that answers the question. I can't do it.
So another question is, I missed it. Where can I find that list of multiphonics?
Yes, that's going to be at the end of the handout.
But it's not a list, right? Sorry.
It's okay. So at the end of my handout, and I will be sending this to Elizabeth, so it will be hopefully given to every single person who is here. There is, in fact, a resource sheet. So yeah, basically what you'll want to do is open up one of those books, for example, the Refelt book. Let's say Refelt wrote this book called New Directions for Clarinet, and in it is like a big chapter on multiphonics. And the way it's usually organized is actually by sound quality in this book. So if you're looking for something that has like a more subtle quality, a softer kind of sound, you'll go directly to that page, and there'll be a list of those kinds of multiphonics with different pitches that you can choose from. Usually it's in like pitch order, and then for example, like a shrill, like intense multiphonic, go to that section and you'll see an array of choices. So again, that's one resource. There's also Heather Roche's blog, Roche. She has a lot of really great multiphonic resources there with recordings. And in general, I would urge all of you to be sure to talk to your clarinet player. If you're writing stuff like this, make sure they're comfortable, make sure they've tested it out, and they can send you recordings on their phone or something if you need to work virtually till you find something that everyone can agree upon. Because they're not kind of like user fits all. Like if you see a fingering on a page in a resource and go, that's the one, it doesn't mean that I can then immediately do it the exact way that the writer of that book thought it would work. So
another question from Brooks Clark. Is it acceptable / not annoying for you to add materials to the metal bell of the bass clarinet?
It's
like
not.
Like a small traffic cone or funnel.
Oh.
Will it affect the pitch at all? I promise I am not on acid, and I'm basing this question off what I have seen in the group Moonhooch do with tenor and bari sax.
Moonhooch does sound a little bit like we're on something, but okay. I've never heard of that group. That's awesome. I can't wait to check it out. I have never did you say a traffic cone?
Yeah.
I've never done that before. I don't have one, but that's so cool. I'd love to know more about that. I'll look into it. What I imagine it would do is change only the bottom note and detune it. Because what you'll be doing if you have a good seal on the bottom of the instrument with the bell is if you can seal something to this, it'll probably lower the pitch It might mute it a lot. It really depends on the object. However, I have done tinfoil, and tinfoil is actually really cool. Again, these kinds of applications to the instrument will only affect the bottom note. That's the written low C.
Why is that?
Because, thank you for asking, all the keys are open. I mean, it's hard to see in the camera, but when all these keys are open, the air is basically diverted in different directions. When all the keys are closed, that is when I'm lowering all of my keys, everything is covered, and I'm playing the lowest note of my instrument, the air is only directed towards the bell. And so now I have a lot more control over the kind of the sound effect that I can create. So what I do here is I loosely attach, it's in the microphone, I loosely attach some tinfoil to the bell. And then when I do that, a lot of it's available to kind of flap around, and that's what's going to happen because the air is all being directed towards the bell. It has this like really gritty quality. It's really cool. And I was going to show you guys split tone anyway, so I will go ahead. And I don't think
There are some more questions.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Is that cool?
Yeah,
there's like a bunch of them.
that's exciting. Sorry.
Okay, so Brittany asks, what does the BCL_M57 mean in measure 87? So I'm going to go ahead and reshare that so we're all looking at the same thing.
Great.
Go ahead and...
Thank you for that question.
your
I'm
thing.
glad you guys are paying attention to the score because these scores are really, I think, very useful when you're studying, just like looking at lots of different ways the composer has written for these extended techniques. So here in this example that I was showing you earlier, the composer actually received all of these fingerings from Henri Bach's book for bass clarinet. I think it's called, I don't know, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what it's called. It's a good book, a very good resource of multiphonics. And in Henri Bach's book, that is just multiphonic 57 in the book. And BCL stands for bass clarinet in this case, so that the bassoonist and I can both go to the book, right? Because in the bassoon, you can see BSN for bassoon. We can both go to our respective books and make sure that the fingerings are there, and also kind of look around and see if there were better ones. It was just a resource for us to know where the multiphonic came from.
Okay, so another question from Austin. Was that embouchure that did that, or air pressure?
Correct.
Both?
So that's when I changed
Or both.
pitches. Yeah. So when I change pitch, it's kind of like if a trumpet player is to do the same kind of thing where they that is a classic riff because it doesn't involve moving the keys. I don't play trumpet. That's a disclaimer. But I'm not doing a great job about that today. But basically what I'm doing is I'm changing my embouchure. I'm changing like the tongue position. I'm changing the pressure on the reed. I'm doing a lot of different things to be able to get different notes without having to move my fingers.
Hayden asks, how do you notate what you just did? That was cool, but I have no idea what that was in reference to. So...
Was it that? Who knows? Hayden, you can ask again. I apologize that I missed that question.
Alvin borrowed the book. Brooks gave us a link to Moon Hoot, which is rad.
Cool.
Natalie says it sounds like a fan, which is cool.
Thank you.
Okay, 2 questions from Benjamin. Lansing's also giving a bunch of links, which is great.
Thank you.
Roche's website, etc., etc. Ben asks 2 questions. First, and just to reiterate, when notating multiphonics, do I need to include both the fingering and all pitches if I would like a specific multiphonic?
Yeah, it's possible that you asked that before I went into it. Also, I did cover this, but I'll go back. Yes, if you're going into, let's say, a resource that has all the pitches written down and you already know what it's going to be that the clarinetists and you've worked out, put them in. Certainly doesn't hurt. But for me, what I primarily need to see and what I think a lot of clarinetists need to see is that top note, because that's how I'm going to base what partial my embouchure is going to be in. So.
And second, if I do not desire a specific multiphonic, would it be appropriate to notate the general range of the multiphonic as well as a sound descriptor, or would more information be needed?
I've seen that. I typically. It's not very difficult to find something, but I can see what you're saying. But is that the last question on that? Because there's something I can go into regarding that question.
Oh yeah, Hayden was asking the trick with the unspecified multiphonic.
Okay, so unspecified multiphonics. What is often easier to write is actually just a split tone, and I'm going to get into what a split tone is right now. So basically,
Do you want them to see this?
if there's not much to look at just now, if you
Okay,
want.
great. Just let me know whenever you want.
Yeah, thank you. So for split tone, what I do, not just me, we all do, is I'm playing a multiphonic without using a fingering combination. So I'm, for example, going to play the very lowest note of the instrument. And when I use my air column and I use my embouchure and everything involved inside embouchure as well, I can actually split that note into a giant multiphonic sound without using, again, any fingers. So I'm actually playing like a bad embouchure to get that kind of sound. And this is great because if you just want, I think that's what someone asked, Hayden, or I forget who asked, is if you just want like a gritty sound and you don't want to have to worry about like math and partials and going into a book and looking up the fingering and asking the clarinet player, yada yada, the split tone is like your thing. And what's cool about split tone, which is similar, is that if you give me a specific pitch to aim for above my note, I can actually play a lot of variety. Right, so there's a lot I can do. And again, I haven't moved a single finger. I'm doing all of that because I practiced control of my embouchure to be able to do that. So if you're just looking for like a crazy intense sound, you can give me a split tone. Perhaps you can give me a note to aim for, or you can just generally say high, middle, or low if you're having different kinds of sounds mixed together that way.
Can you show them an example? Because they really want to know how to write it.
Jump in.
And
I just wasn't ready yet. Mm-hmm. Screen share. Great, so here's my split tone section. For your reference, you'll be looking at this later. You'll see here the zones. Zone 1, 2, Zone 3, Zone 4. Xenakis does this when he was writing, different harmonic sounds. That's one way, or you can actually give me a pitch height. In terms of how to notate it, I don't have the best examples in front of me, unfortunately, but here is a measure from Curtis Hughes' Vestibule 3, which is on our first album, where he just writes becoming harsh, and I interpreted that as split tone. Right, so you can see that the split tone is being used again in the very bottom of my range. Here's another one, which might be a little bit better, but still this is an early piece, so I'm not sure this is the best example either. Right here is the split tone, and you can see that the composer is showing me to go up, he used an 8VA, and then back down. So that is kind of what it looked like on the score. But there's a lot of ways to write stuff like this. I'm trying to see if I did any others. There's a lot of ways to write like stuff like this. In the beginning here, and this is not copied well, this section, this section here is also a split tone section. The composer chose to write like a stem filled in with like this like meaty texture in the middle, so telling me to do it. And that's the beginning of this piece. This is actually the first piece ever written for me by Stephen Gorbosa Tangoid. Yay, memories. Okay. So whether or not that answers all of the notation questions, at least it gives you an impression. And as with any extended technique, it should be said, there's not really a standardized practice except for the one that we're constantly developing. So research, look at scores. I'm happy to make scores available for you. If if you guys want something, I'll send you guys a little packet of some examples. But just do some research and just see what other people are doing. And don't forget to include like a page explaining what different note heads mean and what different things that you were doing in the piece are going to mean for the performer, so that you don't have to be standing next to them and explaining all the time. Yeah, so that is kind of, I'm just going to do a couple like really quick tricks because I do want to close off my portion of the talk.
You can so much more fun than mine.
But I'll just do like an assortment of different sounds, and I'll just quickly answer any other questions that you might have. So not that I'm very good at it, but you can sing and play at the same time. So I'm singing and playing. But one thing that I really love to do is the slap tongue. And I want to bring that up because there are a lot of ways to... No? You're not happy.
No, just before we move past the singing and playing thing, they should ask if they're writing for someone if they're willing to do that.
Oh,
right?
yeah. I mean, I guess I keep saying that, but I'll keep saying it. You make a good point.
Because
to remind you, as with any extended technique, do ask the performer. And for me, specifically, if you're writing to sing, I am bad at singing, and I have a range of a crappy alto, and I have trouble finding the notes because I don't have a good ear, I guess, when I'm playing somehow. I feel like I can find notes better when I'm not playing. Anyway, so you want to make sure the performer is comfortable before you just like put it on the page and go, that looks cool. But that's a disclaimer for literally all the sounds that I'm showing you because extended techniques are personal. Some people just don't know how to do them. Some people are uncomfortable just doing them kind of on the spot. You just don't know, and so you have to ask. And that's that, about that. So my favorite thing is slap tongue. Slap tongue is an articulation, just like a staccato or tenuto. It tells me how to articulate the note. And the way that I do a slap tongue is that I actually put my whole tongue on the reed, and then I curve the middle of the tongue to create like a suction cup. And when I pull my tongue away, the tongue and the reed are still stuck together, but eventually the reed gives up and thwack hits the mouthpiece. So that's just the general sound. Now that I was keeping my embouchure off the instrument, so we had an unpitched slap tongue. That could be notated, well, let me go to the regular slap tongue first. A slap tongue is often notated by a plus sign. Not everyone does it the same way. This is not standardized practice, but if you give me a regular note and put a plus sign on top of it, I'm gonna go, I'll play a regular note, and I will, again, it's an articulation, I will begin the note with a slap tongue. If you want me to do an unpitched slap tongue, you'll need to have a different note head for me to know that this is going to be an unpitched or like maybe an air sound that follows the slap tongue. Right? I'm not making any pitch, I'm just doing the articulation. So the note itself actually doesn't matter that much, but I'll need to see an empty note head of some kind to make sure that I don't make a pitch. But yeah, I will show you what all the different notes sound like. If I go from like the top of my bottom register all the way to the bottom, I'm just gonna do an unpitched slap tongue. What will they sound like? Very subtly, I can hear pitch differences, but not that much. It should be noted that it doesn't really matter all that much what my fingers are pressing if I do an unpitched slap tongue. If you could hear something different, I mean, then I'm wrong and you can write it, but I actually don't think there's a lot of difference. But when I do it with pitch, I can hold the note because it's just an articulation. So I think that's pretty much it with that, but I will say unpitched has a lot of variety. So I can get a lot of different like baby pops, I can get big pops. I mean, it can be very loud and very exciting. So it's something that I practiced for a long time. I want to say this because slap tongue is it's a very specific technique that people don't just do. So if you're getting a clarinet player who you're going to school with and you want them to do a piece and you write a slap tongue, they might not know how to do it. It took me about a month. I watched all of Deep Space Nine from beginning to end with a mouthpiece in my mouth practicing. Not in one day, but over the course of, like I said, a month. Because I had no friends. Anyway, I think that's all I want to talk about, but if there's any burning questions or desires, I'll jump in. Yeah.
But slap tongue is still relatively common.
It's extremely
but it's
common.
more like you shouldn't like...
But you shouldn't assume that anyone knows how to do any technique. It's just, I just don't think that we're in a place where you can assume anyone knows.
And especially like when you're dealing with your colleagues, like if you're a student.
Exactly.
Like you shouldn't make a fellow student feel bad for not knowing how to do it, right?
And you should also know that you can't just be like, oh, we'll just watch this video and, yada, 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 has this video and it looks like it'll be easy to learn. It takes a long time. It took me a month. And even then when I got on stage and tried to do it, it wasn't 100% comfortable. I mean, I've been doing it now for many, many years, so I do feel confident, but it's one of those things, so.
Okay, so going back, Mike Powers asked, can slap tongue damage the reed?
Nope. Maybe for some people. Depends on how along the process they are. I have finally gotten to the point where I no longer shatter my reeds, but in my first year of slap tongue, my reeds were like falling apart all the time. So it's a good question.
Okay. Important question. Picard or Janeway?
Oh wow, it's definitely Picard, but I love Janeway. Oh, sorry, it depends on in the question's context. Like if you're talking about what show is better, like I just like Next Gen more than Voyager, but man, I'm all about Janeway. I don't know. That's too hard, guys. That's a hard question. Oh my god.
No, he captain, not the
Yeah, it's so hard.
ship.
Let's skip it. It's too much.
It's too much.
It's too political.
So Justin asks, is slap tongue much harder on the soprano clarinet?
No. Oh, sorry. Maybe. Let me show you. Good question. So the reed is smaller, so there's a lot more possibility for me to not be able to do it. Well, see, hang on. I'm bad at it on clarinet. Great. Yeah, I'm bad at it on clarinet.
Well,
oh, sorry.
no,
I gave
it seemed like the non-pitched ones were successful, but the pitched ones were less.
It's because I need to reset my. I need to practice it.
But is it actually harder?
So it's not that it's harder. It's just that you have to find the spot on the reed with the tongue, and there's a lot of complications about this. When I'm basically making room for my tongue to do all this stuff, what's happening right now is my embouchure is too low, and because of that, I'm getting a higher note. And I haven't done it in a while on the clarinet, so I think if I just spent some time, it would sound fine. But it's just a different technique. Yeah.
And what techniques do you feel are underutilized on the great clarinet that you would like to see people use more?
What a question. Oh, goodness. Good old-fashioned notes. Like really great notes. No, I mean, I'm kidding.
Are you though?
I don't know. I mean, it's funny. Like I love doing split tones and I love doing multiphonics and I love doing slap tongues. But then sometimes when you say that, you do get like a piece over and over again that sounds kind of like the same kind of techniques. So it really is dependent on, I guess, how the sounds are being used. I think is more important than the sounds themselves. I think that when you use an extended technique, you want it to contextually make sense. You want to have an idea. You want to have intent, and you want the sound has to be like the only way. I'm not a composer, but I feel like that's true. Like there has to be no other way to get your content and intent across than using this sound. It can't just be a gimmick. You can't just be like, well, my piece has only notes in it, and I guess I should have a multiphonic. And I've done that kind of thing before, where someone said, oh, what multiphonic can you just throw in a multiphonic in there? To a piece that sounded like really tonal and was pretty and didn't need it. Just because I think the composer felt like the piece wasn't modern enough. And I don't think that that's required. So that being said, I don't know how to answer the question.
Do you, we never actually showed them how to notate a slap tongue. Do you have any examples in your handout that you think?
Yeah, the slap tongue is notated with a plus sign over the note. I mentioned it, but
yeah, I know. But what does that mean? You
the
mean
plus
like on
sign.
the stem?
The plus sign is an articulation that is like instead of like a staccato or a tenuto. However, you can also put a staccato and a tenuto below the note because the slap tongue can be short and can be long. So I guess typically you would have a space for the plus sign above the note and a space for articulation wherever the note head is facing in that spot.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't want the plus sign like far away from the note head.
The plus sign has to be an articulation. Much like you would use like an accent and a tenuto together, you can use a plus sign and a tenuto together, I think. The plus sign tells me to slap tongue, and then any other articulation that's there will tell me how to treat the note following that articulation.
Alvin asked, Benjamin asked, can you demonstrate air tones?
Yes.
And can one gradually transition from air to full?
Yeah, and if you want to, I can screen share something like that right now. Do you mind doing that?
Yeah, no problem.
So here is an example of air sound notation. Can be done lots of different ways, but here's really cool because in this piece, the composer shows me a full filled in dot to showcase a regular full tone sound, and then gradually changing to that empty circle, which shows me air sound. And if I wanted to do a half air sound, you could also have a symbol like that, a circle, and then half filled in. And you can use arrows to get to that note and arrows to come back. So I can do a number of different ways. So now if I just do it that way, that's really effective in this particular instance. This piece was about like wave sounds, and for this particular piece I chose to do this like really like light air sound because it's like a wave receding, and so that air sound is the receding part of the music. But in the case of like an air sound that you want to be more present, I can add vocalizations like s or you know, basically not that one I just did. Basically, if I add resistance using my tongue, I can not only make the air sound louder, but I can also increase my lung capacity because I'm not just going, because that's about as long as I can do it, about as long as anyone can do it. Because if I want that hot air sound, I'm basically emptying my lungs. But if I add resistance, like a I can do that for almost as long as I can play a note, maybe actually as long as I can play a note, and it sounds louder. And same thing goes for any kind of resistance addition. So for example, rolling my tongue. What that also seems to do is allows a little bit of pitch to sneak in. So if I move my fingers like I just did, you might actually hear some more pitch content than you would otherwise. Just a little bit.
And someone asked, is there anything to be aware of when writing subtones, perhaps regarding the range? Is it possible on high notes?
Ooh, you're not going to make a lot of friends. Sorry, that's not. Yes, it's possible. Now, a subtone, to be clear for everyone, is basically me just playing extremely softly. I'm not doing anything in particularly different with my technique, except for just like I'm playing very soft. So that, if it gets picked up in the mic, I'll do one low register. So a lot of air sounds just now. I'm not sure how much that's getting picked up, but I'm just going to go ahead and throw in another technique on top of that, and I'll get to your question in a second. But let's talk about split tone in subtone land. Maybe that was audible, but if it wasn't, I'm playing the split tone so soft, it's kind of like a whistle, tiny, tiny, tiny sound on top of the subtone low note. Now, that being said, yes, I can probably play a subtone anywhere, but the clarinet is known for the subtone sound in the bottom register. That's something that a lot of wind instruments cannot do. If you get an oboe player to play their bottom note really, really soft, could they hear it?
They could.
Oh, yay!
Lansing wrote yum.
Yay! I'm so glad it was audible because it's such a good sound. And if I'm teaching a class of kids, that's like one way to get them all to zip up. Like, shh, can you hear this? And okay. Anyway, so anyway, yes, I can play it, but anyway, that's the thing. Sorry, I was getting so distracted. If you get an oboist to play the bottom note on their instrument, it's a struggle to play soft at all. Again, disclaimer, not an oboist. I don't really know. But that's what the clarinet is known for. That's where that technique comes from. If you want me to play a soft note, oh boy. It can be done. Is it as yummy? It's up to you. It's scary for me. So there's that. Anyway, yeah, is that all the questions?
Yeah, I mean, someone did ask if we think that, do you find that new music is often too flooded with extras that take away from the music itself? That's kind of loaded.
I covered that a little bit already.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it depends on the music again. It's all from me about like, what are we trying to say? I want to say something. I want to communicate. And so if I'm just making noises because the composer thought it looked cool to do that for me doesn't have any emotional weight. I'm just not, not that into it. But
let's be honest, and this is important, like
Yeah.
as a percussionist, extended techniques aren't extra musical sounds. They aren't separate from music. We don't want to imply that music is just notes, because it's not.
Yeah, that's not what I mean.
It's more like you're playing a piece and then you feel like extended techniques were jammed in just because. That is that's what we feel is less successful.
I want every decision on the page to be because that's what was required for the music to get across, and that comes with notes, that decisions, and sound decisions, any of that stuff. I want to feel like the piece was crafted because there was a reason. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. That just is my approach to performing. And so when I'm working with a composer to create the sound world that they want, that's what I'm going for. Not like, I haven't played a trill between these notes in a while, or I haven't done a really high loud note in a while. I want a composer to feel like they're able to express, that we're both able to express what the piece is about. So, and with that, I'm gonna move over to Matt's part of the talk. Thank you.
Way to go, Amy.
I went over. I knew it. I didn't even look at the clock before I started.
No, it's okay. I always feel like your talk is cooler because your instrument makes more sounds.
Go for it. Don't be sad.
Anyway, cool. So, hi everyone. My name's Matt. I'm the Marimbist and Transient Canvas. Yeah. So I just want to give you a quick overview of writing for the marimba. You might already have access to my handout in another format. I'm actually going to be updating this handout pretty significantly this summer, I've realized. But anyway, here's a start. So, one thing I want to point out to you are two amazing resources for writing for marimba, specifically, and percussion in general. One of those resources is Nancy Zeltzman's website, where she has a memo to composers. Nancy was my teacher, my marimba teacher, when I did my master's degree in Boston, and she's one of the most important pioneers in making the marimba a serious instrument and not just like an extension of percussion or a vaudeville sideshow kind of instrument. And this memo to composers, she actually wrote in like 1989, but it's still amazingly useful. And some of the graphics that I use in my handout come from this. So this is her website. This is something that she wrote, like I said, a long time ago. Her use of smiley and frowny faces I feel are extremely vital. Anyway, back to this. Nancy's important because she is one of the first people, other than Lee Howard Stevens and Bob Van Cise, to basically say that I am a marimbist, not a percussionist. The other resource is Samuel Solomon's book, How to Write for Percussion, and I feel very strongly that every composer should buy this book. If you have to buy the Adler orchestration book, which I despise with every fiber of my being as a percussionist, I think you should also own this if you can. It's an amazing resource, and Sam's new edition of the book has like 400 videos that come along with it, which are extremely useful. Okay, I got some chats going on that I should read.
Do you want me to do that while you're doing it?
Sorry. But yeah, you absolutely must own Sam Solomon's book if you can. If you can't, borrow it from someone. Your school library should own it. All the comp faculty who are on this right now, you should get your schools to buy this book because it is, as far as I'm concerned, the only really useful orchestration book for percussion. I know I really like to mock the Sam Adler book, and I do that because the approach in that book and in many orchestration books is a very old-fashioned view of percussion as being like a closet full of stuff that you throw in the back of an orchestra. Plus the Adler timpani rangers are wrong. Anyway, moving on. So, basic characteristics and instrument range of the marimba itself. These are the ranges of the most common marimbas. The 5-octave marimba goes all the way down to C2, which is the same low note as a cello. I got it. And then the upper note is C, let's see, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. C7 is my high note. So basically, the marimba extends up to almost the same range as a xylophone. The xylophone has an extra octave on the marimba. And as far as, I'm using that camera, it's pointed at me. I got it. So the 5-octave marimba first became common in the mid-'80s, and even when I was an undergrad in the early mid 2000s, you know, there were still a lot of conversations of like, should I write for a 5-octave or not? Now that answer is less. And it used to be like, oh well, don't write for a 5-octave unless the person owns, you know, blah blah blah. You can basically assume if you're writing for marimba that you can use a 5-octave. This depends on the city that you're in. And the people you're working with. But typically, if someone considers themselves a marimba player, if they're playing marimba specifically on its own, 5-octave is the better choice because it has more autonomy. But someone did ask, is a 4.3 octave instrument the most common? The answer to that question is yes. So the low A marimba is the most common marimba. And I will say that if you're writing for marimba in an orchestra, or marimba as part of a multi-percussion setup, marimba as part of a chamber ensemble that involves other percussion instruments, a 4.3 octave instrument is a much better choice. Basically, you should only, if you're talking about marimba in a large setting, you only should write for a 5-octave if you can actually hear those low notes. I can't tell you how many times I've played something with bemop where I get hired specifically because I own a 5-octave and I show up and they pay me the extra cartage and they have to rent the instrument from someone, and then it's like, you know, I'm playing like a low C while the orchestra is doubling me at fortissimo. That's bad orchestration. But anyway, if you're writing for solo marimba, just marimba in an ensemble like this, I would recommend using a 5-octave because you can do so much more. That extra fifth is very, very helpful. All right. Always a grand staff. I am going to get there. If you're talking about writing for me specifically, and writing for marimba by itself, I always prefer a grand staff. Almost. We're going to get there. All right. So, yeah, all right. So people ask, no, again, let me think about this. I'm just going to screen share, it's just easier. I'll unscreen share when I need to show you something. So, if we're talking 20, 30 years ago, you as a composer would have had to given serious thought on, is this a 2-mallet or a 4-mallet piece? That's really not the case anymore. People who play percussion and who are under the age of 45, under the age of 50, for us, 4-mallet technique was a part of our training. So there's no longer a question of like, you know, does this person feel comfortable holding 4 mallets? It's just something that we do. Amy, are you opening Zoom? It just signed us out.
How could it sign us out? Because
It's open on okay, cool. We're still running. So I got a weird thing. Make sure Zoom's not open on that.
Yeah, it's
Cool. Anyway, so basically marimbas use 4 mallets basically like fingers on a piano. Most of the time we're just going to hold 2 mallets in each hand. Sometimes we might choose not to, but that's not something that you have to specifically worry about. There are 3 main grips that we all use. Again, that is not something that you have to worry about. But in case you're curious, the 3 main grips for 4 mallets are this. I use what's called traditional cross grip, which I like because I was originally a pianist, and this allows me to play basically using my fingers. There's what's called Burton grip, which looks very much like traditional cross grip, but the mallets are crossed the other direction. Then there's Musser-Stevens grip, which looks like this, which is probably the most common in the U.S. Again, it doesn't matter at all to you as a composer what grip I use. Some percussionists will probably go on and on about that, but it really shouldn't matter very much. Now, I will say, some people are then ask me, oh, can you use 6 mallets? Because, you've seen YouTube videos of that. And yes, I can hold 3 mallets in each hand, but it's very clunky. It's way less common for someone to be really good at using 6 mallets, and I found that the repertoire very rarely actually needs it. So what I usually tell composers are, when they're writing for me and they're like, oh my gosh, I really want 5 notes in that chord, I basically tell them, like, is that 5th note the most important note you've ever written? Because that's why you would use that. But so just so you know, like, we can hold more than 2 mallets in each hand often, but it's not usually worth the effort. When you're writing for the marimba is set up like a piano. And so a lot of times composers who are pianists fall into the trap of writing for the marimba at the piano, using your 10 fingers to figure out what is comfortable. You can fall into a lot of traps doing that, because obviously I don't have 10 mallets to work with. So when you're writing and trying to figure out what chords feel okay, what's awkward or not, I recommend making the rock-on symbol with your hands and sitting at your keyboard and testing out chords doing that. That will basically show you relatively accurately what is or is not comfortable on the marimba. Why I bring that up is if, for example, let's say you wrote my right hand alternating very quickly between minor thirds. Let's say I have C sharp and E, and then E flat and C natural. On piano, you just do this. I used to play piano, but my hands don't do that anymore. But it's easy, right? You just like spend time practicing that, do some Hammond exercises. But on marimba, I have to actually spin my hand around to do that. So if you're watching me play that, that's awkward, right? So when you're writing quick chord changes, you need to make sure you're considering how fast one hand has to flip between 2 positions. Kai Stansgaard does, in fact, specialize in 6 mallet technique lancing, that's true, but that is relatively uncommon. Kai is very good at it. So, if you want to write for Kai, you can do that. Cool. One trap that I find people sometimes fall into, so if we're going back, and we're just like talking back about chords again, obviously if I'm only holding 4 mallets, your chords can only consist of 4 notes. You can't give me a 5-note chord or a 6-note chord. But where sometimes people lose track of what they're doing is they're like, I only have 4 notes in this chord, but they don't consider how wide the intervals are. So I'm just going to go back and do a little screen share here. So this little example that I wrote is a way that, again, if you're writing for the marimba at the piano, you're like, that's super simple. I have my triads in my right hand, and I have a bass line. But I should note that that interval on the marimba in my one hand is like 3 feet wide. And when we get to this interval, that is literally half the length of the marimba, because middle C is in the center of the instrument. So if you're at your piano and you're using the rock-on technique to figure out, or even using your thumb and your pinkies, you're going to find that you won't write that interval as often. I would say that in terms of interval ranges in each hand, you can basically assume that you can reach an octave in the low octave of the instrument, and in the upper octaves you can reach a 10th comfortably. The bars on a marimba, as you get lower, get wider. So, for example, this is my octave interval in my bass, and if I take this same interval and play it in the upper octave, that's literally an octave and a 5th. And every marimba brand is different. So I play on marimba ones, which have a relatively consistent bar width. The bars expand very gradually and they don't get that wide. If I play it on a Malatech, for example, the low bars are incredibly wide. And I can't even reach an octave on a Malatech in the low range. So because different marimba brands are so different, unlike pianos, which all have the same size keys, you kind of have to be conservative with your interval sizes. We got some questions coming up. As a percussionist, thank you for pointing this out. Thanks. Are there types of mallets that are uncomfortable using the two mallet technique? Is it cumbersome to have to switch mallets a lot? There aren't really mallets that are uncomfortable to use. You mean if like two mallets in my hand? For it, one would just adapt. Like for example, I often have to use bass drum mallets in pieces that I play. And with my specific grip, this is awkward because the shafts are so wide, but I just switch to a different grip type and it's all fine. Now, is it awkward to change mallets a lot? It can be. You have to consider that when you have someone change mallets, it's going to be an obvious change. As part of learning a piece, we choreograph that kind of thing. So percussion, it's just like choreographing a dance. So like I'll practice like I'm here and then I go and I switch. But you need to give people enough time to do that without looking rushed. And also without extra sounds. If you give me like one beat to change mallets, I'm literally going to play and throw my mallets. And then you're going to hear the mallet throwing sound. So that's something to be aware of when you're switching mallets. What about wide leaps in the upper register? We'll get there. Hand crossing. Oh, hand crossing is a classic pianistic idiom. There's almost no reason to do hand crossing on marimba. Ever. Except for like, let's say that I'm playing, I'm playing an ostinato. I can do something like that where my left hand is doing something else. But the idea of like, remember the marimba can't really sustain particularly. So it's not like on piano where you're like doing this thing and then you cross over because one hand is still holding a note to sustain. Like I would just play and then move my hands around, if that makes sense. Nothing like dead mallet switch time. Oh, like in runs. Oh. So when we play runs, we just alternate our hands normally. So we don't think about crossing over because we use both of our hands to make linear music. I mean, sometimes I will play different combinations of regular and unalternated hands if I want to play a run, but you don't need to tell me to alternate, and you don't need to show me which hand to use. I will get to that in a little bit. Okay, we'll get into a lot of these things. Is there ever a cause to voice a 4-note chord if the inner two notes cross between the two hands? No, you should just write the notes out and I will cross them however I choose. If that makes sense. I mean, it would only make sense if, let's say, I was going to the two manuals. Let's say you gave me an F sharp and a D sharp versus like a D natural and a B. In this case, I might choose to play all the accidentals with one hand and all the natural notes with the other hand. But I could also just stick it this way. And that doesn't change the sound at all. So you don't need to worry about telling me which hand to voice a chord with. But in general, I would say don't automatically. You can almost always assume that the lower notes will be played with the left hand and the higher notes will be played with the right hand. Cool. All right. Oh, sweet. So we're going to talk a little bit about roll notation. So rolls or tremolos, which is what they're called on other instruments, is how percussionists deal with sustain. We view tremolos the same way like Amy would view playing a long tone. It's just a note that is long to us. It's not a special effect. And so to that end, when you're notating rolls on the marimba, and Nancy is, I stole this from her website, which I love this example so much. Example C with the frowny face would be how one would want to see that if they were reading a tremolo on a piano or reading it on a woodwind instrument. But for me as a percussionist, I find that incredibly off-putting because it doesn't actually show me the harmonic motion. So if you're going to write rolled chords, you should always notate them basically like just as a stacked chord with the 3 slashes on them like you were writing a snare drum roll. You don't need to show me which hand to use. If you want me to start with a specific note, you could use a grace note into the tremolo. But otherwise, usually if I'm working with a composer and they really bring this up, that like I want you to start with one specific hand, if I make them do a blind listening, they don't notice when I do one or the other. It's a bit too nebulous. To that end, we can roll with one hand while doing something else with the other hand. Let me just get the chat up. So like, let's say this is an example from a piece that's actually going to be on our next album by Stephanie Lubkowski called Right Now in a Second. And she utilizes sustain in one hand while the other hand does something else. So if I'm rolling here, so I can tremolo with one hand while doing something else with the other hand. You don't need to actually tell me that. Like, you don't need to write in one-handed roll. I will simply assume that's what you mean because one hand is tremoloing and the other hand is doing something else. I hope that makes sense to everyone. But yeah, definitely with rolls in general, do not approach them like you would approach a tremolo on any other instrument. They are simply a method of sustain. And in order for us to see harmonic motion, it's much better to have stacked chords than to have them broken up like that. What about permutation rolls? I mean, so by permutation rolls, the question is like, well, what if I want you to play a specific pattern while you roll? To do that, I would recommend using like Lutoslawski boxes where you write in tiny grace notes that show me the pattern you want, and then an arrow for the length, and that tells me what to do. But the concept of permutation rolls are sort of very tied to marimbists writing marimba music. They're not necessarily that tied to other kinds of performers. So if you want me to play with a specific sticking, you basically have to write out using fast grace notes what you want me to do, and then I will just do it. I hope that answers your question. Oh, how do you notate tremolos that change speed? Feather beaming is a great way to do that. And that is an instance where you would actually probably want to notate a normal like piano hand-to-hand tremolo, because that will actually show me what you're doing. You can also write simply fast roll, slow roll, or accel roll, decel roll, and then just notate otherwise the same. And then that would also make a lot of sense. I find that feather beaming gets tricky if it's a long passage. It's better to simply write, slow down as you get soft, speed up as you get fast, or something like that. But most of us are going to change our roll speeds anyway, depending on what we're doing, just like one would change vibrato. So. Cool. So, let's see. Okay, what should we do with some time here? Orchestration choices. Linear versus pianistic writing. The marimba is a keyboard instrument, and I love it for that. I was in my youth a pianist, and I liked playing chamber music, but I never liked how I always felt like I was so separate from the people I was playing with. When I play marimba in a duo setting or a chamber setting, I feel much closer to the people I'm working with, and so I love that. However, the marimba is not a piano. It can play more than one note at once. It can play polyphonic music to an extent, but where it's really the most successful is when you write for the marimba in a linear way. Basically, thinking of it like a percussive cello or a percussive violin, utilizing double stops to add emphasis when you want, but otherwise it works very well when you write notes. So this is actually an example from Lansing's piece that we're going to be playing on Thursday that works really well. Lansing utilizes the broad range of the instrument to give this really awesome sensation of polyphony occasionally. He utilizes my full range in a really exceptional way, but it still works really well, and it's very fast and exciting. And then down here he adds double stops, which help. Now, when you are choosing to write for the marimba in a non-linear fashion, it also works super well as a chordal instrument, where I'm playing all of the notes at once. And that's sort of the beginning of why people developed formala techniques anyway, was because people wanted to play chords. The top example here is from a piece called Monochrome by Keith Kirchhoff. I should mention that I really hate the rhythmic notation here, and Keith knows that, where he has 16th rests all over the place. Since I don't actually sustain particularly, you could have just written that as like 8th note, dotted 8th, 16th, etc. But his use of the instrument is really effective. This works really well. It's crunchy, it's awesome, he plays with the overtones, works really well. Another option would be this example from Jonathan Bailey Holland's Rebounds, which is much, much more lyrical, but also still utilizes the marimba chordally really well. You'll note that he has one hand crescendoing at different rate as the other hand. Again, works super well. The piece you heard us play first by Matthew Welsh, Lumba Lumba Hijau, managed to give the sensation of a bass line and a soprano line by simply spreading the notes out really far. This is an example from Matt's piece, and you notice he utilizes cross-staff beaming. That is an extremely effective way to write for the marimba. I hate it when I'm seeing something and it's like a bunch of rests in the left hand and then a bunch of rests in the right hand, but the hands are just alternating. It's always best to go across the staves like this. And this allows the feeling of having a separate bass line from the upper line, but my hands are alternating so I don't have to be all tense. And this is also an example from Tina Talon's Dirty Water, which you can listen to on our album Sift, which is on Spotify and Apple Music and what have you. And again, she does the same thing. She leaps across the marimba's range, so you get the different timbral effects of the different registers, and it feels like there's a bass line and a soprano line, but really it's all one long line. And this is just something that I rewrote to kind of highlight the whole easy to read thing. This is actually a student piece that we got many years ago. And this top example is the actual composer's original version. The totally innocent mistake of not doing cross-staff beaming, that's very difficult to read. But the bottom example is actually quite easy for a marimbist to read, to give you kind of some context there. Okay. Hold on. Now, where the marimba really struggles is where you're trying to write an accompanying bass line and a melody in the right hand. It doesn't work as well. It's much more difficult, mostly because we only have 2 mallets in each hand, so triadic-based writing is actually, it takes some doing, it takes some choreography. So this is like a really simple piano part that I wrote out that's like mind-numbingly easy on the piano. But on the marimba, I have to like fling my hand up. So if you watch me play that, there we go. You know, I have to play up basically all the notes with 1 mallet. You know, I can do that, and that's fine. But given the fact that the harmonies never shift, it would be much easier to instead have the left hand simply oscillate between C and G. Because that basically allows me to stop thinking about my left hand. It serves the same harmonic purpose, and I can actually shape the right hand. It should be said, though, that left-hand accompaniment, right-hand melody can sound pretty dopey on the marimba, because it kind of sounds like plunk, 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 plunk. I have less individual control over notes. So I do find linear writing, chordal writing, creating bass lines by alternating my hands, that's a much more effective and expressive way to write for the marimba than to think of it like a piano. Is counterpoint, like 2-voice, for example, problematic on the marimba? It depends. If you're going to write counterpoint, you should only use 2 voices. So, but I mean, I play Bach, like the lute suites. Yeah, I can play 2-voice parts like that. It's more so when like one hand is playing like some repetitive triadic pattern that I find the marimba is less effective, because I have to do a lot more choreography and I can't focus on my individual notes. In many ways, 2 voices moving at once is actually easier as long as it's more stepwise, if that makes sense. Those bass buffs. Okay, so this is getting into the part where I talk about using the grand staff. The marimba is really big, and it's hard to tell from the angle I'm at right now, but it's 8 feet long. And it's also, like I said, the bars are different widths. So if I'm standing in the middle of the marimba, I'm actually standing in front of middle C. Middle C is literally in the middle of most marimba brands, and the bottom 2 octaves take up the same amount of space as the top 3 octaves. So I use the grand staff as a way for me to visualize how I'm moving across the marimba. I don't use the grand staff to tell me which hand to use. This is different from how a pianist uses the grand staff. So percussionists in general are used to we alternate our hands to make lines of music happen. Whereas a pianist is going to use one hand and their fingers to play a line and then play another line. So because we alternate so much anyway, and this is how we play, you don't need to tell me which hand does what. But also to that end, because the marimba is so, let me get to that. So when I have double treble or double bass clefs in the music that I play, I find it very viscerally upsetting because it completely screws up my entire idea of where notes are. So look at this top example. For a pianist, this would be a logical and intelligent way to write this progression of fifths, you know? I don't know how to play music anymore. Anyway, but what this looks like, so what this means, of course, is I'm just going up, right? But what it looks like I'm doing is I'm going up with one hand and back down with the left hand. Much more effective would be to notate it this way, where I can see the notes are all moving up. Now, I have kind of changed my view on this since I wrote this handout. You can show me, if it's obvious what hand I'm going to use to play a note, it is easier if you show me. Seeing 4 notes blocked together like that is kind of aesthetically displeasing. I think nowadays I would recommend this instead. It's always, for percussionists, it is just basically a standard technique where if you want to show me lines, like left hand, right hand, you can use down stems for left hand and up stems for right hand. And this is actually an easier way for me to see that, if that makes sense. And so then down here, what's up, Amy?
Probably 5 more minutes.
Yeah, sure. And so down here, I show the one example where the double treble clefs might make sense, and that's basically where one hand is stuck on one manual, and the other hand is weaving in and out of that hand. So, like, you know, I can see the left hand's motion better in the bottom version, but since I wrote this handout, I also think that this doesn't need to be 2 treble clefs because of where I wrote it. This could just be a bass clef, and then these notes could be up here. And I would just keep that all up out of the way, and that would actually be much easier. Because the point is that you want, what I find upsetting about double treble and double bass clefs is that basically, like, if the notes are close together, I want them to look close together. So I don't like having, like, this line so far away from what my right hand is doing. Because also keep in mind that the music is much further away from me. So this is a bad example of double treble clefs just because, like, they're all moving around the middle C range. Oh, thanks. Did you see much music from multiple performers on a single marimba? Yes. That's totally fine. It's like piano 4 hands. Prepared marimba that I've seen or done. Right, cool. All right. And again, you know, this handout is available from the festival. You all might actually already have it. Oh, right. This is what I want to get to. Now, if you don't need both staves, I don't need to see both staves. If all of the music takes place in the bass clef, you don't need to have an empty treble clef for a whole line. You can get rid of them if you're not using them to save space on the page. But also to that end, you know, one might ask, why can't I just throw in a clef change? And the reason for that is that clef changes are totally fine if you aren't using the clef change in the middle of a run, basically. Because let's say I'm playing some run up to E5 from like middle C, and then I leap down to the bottom E on the marimba, E2. So let's say I'm going like, and then play that low note. If you just put in a bass clef before the low note, it looks like I'm leaping towards middle C, but I'm actually leaping down something that's 3.5 feet further away. Again, the whole spatial thing. Clef changes are fine to save space as long as you aren't breaking up a line. If you're breaking up a line, it's really discombobulating. And I would rather just you put the grand staff in for that moment. All right. Blah, blah, blah. Articulations are great. Please give them to me as if I was an actual real instrument. I love seeing legato lines and phrase lines and accents and staccatos. Yes, I know the marimba only rings long enough to be annoying and not long enough to be useful. But by you showing me what you wish it could sound like, it affects how I play. If I just see notes and rhythms with no slurs, no articulation markings at all, it just makes my soul die. Because it's basically, I feel like you're telling me that I can't be a real instrument. And I know that's not usually what people are doing, but, you know, basically write articulations for me like I'm a piano. I can't really sustain, and you shouldn't write long notes because, well, you can write long notes, but, like, you know, if I don't roll them, they'll only last so long. But showing me slurs and accents are very helpful. Where am I? Staccato, that's a good question. How would staccatos be useful? Well, I can actually control making notes shorter by leaving my mallet on the bar. It's called a dead stroke. There are different kinds of dead strokes. There's like a full-on dead stroke where I like jam my mallets into the bar, and that sounds more like an extended technique. But I can also just leave my mallets laying on the bar. the notes are short, you can still hear the pitch. It's not accented, but it's still. So staccatos, basically, I interpret them as different kinds of dead strokes because I want them to literally be short. Some marimbas interpret them as just like lifting your mallet off the bar to feel lighter. Some people just do something visual, which I think is annoying. But again, it just tells me how you wished it could be phrased, and then it gives me the ability to try to do that. You know, it's a lot more inspiring to see like as opposed to da 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 da. Do you know what I mean? Oh, that is great to hear. I've been told not to slur on marimba and was surprised by that. You can definitely write slurs on marimba because that tells me how to phrase. So definitely do that. I don't know who told you not to do that, but they are wrong. Cool. Okay, extend techniques, blah, blah, blah. Man, I never get to that part. Sorry, mallet choice. This is very important. Please don't write soft mallet, hard mallet, medium mallet, because that means literally nothing. I know, you can look at lots of examples in the repertoire. I'm sure your composition teachers can pull out lots of pieces written by people where it's like, look, they wrote like hard mallet here. You should tell them to use that. Hard mallet means literally nothing because there are thousands of mallet models. There are hundreds of mallet brands. They're all different, and everyone's interpretation of hard, soft, and medium is different. I guarantee that being a Nancy Zeltzman student, my entire concept of sound is like in the soft mallet range. My hardest mallet is probably the softest mallet of someone who studied marimba in the 50s, for example. Because it's all like a matter of sound preference. What I want instead are descriptors. I want bright, murky, flowy, something like that. You should tell me mallet choice, however, when you want a specific timbre. So for example, if you want me to use xylophone mallets, I can do that on the upper register. Because the upper register of the marimba is the same as a xylophone. Now I still wrap them in moleskin. Some people, don't write xylophone mallets on the low register because I can crack a note. And just so you know, the low C on a marimba costs $700 to replace on its own. So don't crack those notes. But again, xylophone mallets, rubber or latex mallets. I love latex mallets. These things are awesome. It's like slap bass. It's great. Tell me to use that. Super Ball mallets. They sound really cool on like bass drum and stuff, but on the marimba, they just kind of sound like a fart. But they're a pitched fart, so if you're into that, you can write it, and that's totally cool. That's like, you do you, In the upper register, it kind of sounds like blowing over bottle tops, etc. Bass drum mallets, I showed you, were great. Chopsticks are awesome, I particularly like chopsticks because they're not going to scratch the bars because they're made of really cheap wood. Also, if I use chopsticks inside my resonator, that sounds pretty sweet. Let's see if we get that can be really fun, Depends on what you're into. And brushes. Now, I will say brushes. Metal brushes are going to scratch your marimba. How do you notate play on the resonator? You would have to put it in the score. I'd recommend using like a block note head, like a square note shape, and just treat it like, just put that in the key. Like square shaped note heads are resonators, or put a separate staff. The resonators don't, depends on how you're using it. The resonators don't have like specific pitches. Anyway, with brushes, be careful. I mean, they sound cool and they're really cool when they're soft, but if they're too loud, I can scratch the bars unless I use brushes made of something other than metal. And in terms of extended techniques, like this is where I feel like Amy has it way better than me because she has like extended techniques that people do. But the marimba at the end of the day is a percussion instrument. So it's kind of like use your imagination. I can prepare the marimba, I can put aluminum foil, for example, on the resonators. And it kind of sounds like electric guitar. I can dampen the bars with like a cloth. Stuff like that. I can take hex bugs, which are little toys, and tape them to the bar, and they make this humming sound. Again, but remember that the marimba is made of an endangered hardwood, so don't do anything that you think might scratch it or break it. Now, I will say that like mallet shafts glistening across the marimba is bad for the instrument because it scratches it. I know Lockenmon does it in Trio Florido, and it sounds really awesome, and I love playing that piece, but I don't play that piece on my own marimba. I'll only use it on like a beater marimba. Again, in my handout, I list some more options, but really, like, if you just go online and look up marimba techniques, there's a lot of stuff that I've never thought about. Bowing is pretty common. I do bowing a lot. You know, just like bowed vibraphone, except it doesn't ring afterwards, but bowing can be super cool. I can do pitch bends like a vibraphone can. Marim shots, where you hit both the bar and the shaft at the same time. Treat those like Bartok pizzas, like I can't do them very fast, but as single notes they can sound cool. I can bow the resonators and they sound like a bowed cymbal. Oh, what else can I do? I can literally play on the resonators, which can sound pretty hip. I can do that. I can play inside the bass resonators. It kind of sounds like a slap tongue. Or the very end piece. Anyway, think of it like, it's like playing inside the piano, you know? And again, with that, just like playing inside the piano, some pianists are like, no, I won't do that because it'll hurt the piano. And some marimbas are like, no, I won't do that because it'll hurt the marimba. So you should talk to the person you're writing for. In the folder that Elizabeth has from us, I have a list of extended techniques and videos from pieces that are written for us that you are welcome to check out. But yeah, just use your imagination. I do encourage you though, like when I'm playing marimba, I want to play marimba. Because the marimba can and should be its own thing. I don't need to schlep a table full of junk with me if I can just use the frame and the resonators to make those sounds. Just so, look at it this way. If you're writing for a 5-octave marimba and you're writing for a marimba part, and you're like, boy, I really wish I had a bongo here. Ask yourself, if I was writing this for a pianist, would I say to them, boy, I wish I had a bongo here? And if your answer to that question is no, then don't do it and find another solution inside the marimba. I used to, with Transient Canvas, I used to offer up marimba, like a marimba multi-setup option, but I usually found that the pieces were way less effective because it was like marimba music, then a cymbal roll, and the extra stuff sounded out of place. I find that if you really limit yourself and get creative with the instrument you're working with, you can get a lot more done. Anyway.
I think we're done.
Oh wow, I think we're done.
We don't need to play anything else.
Yeah. Sorry, that was really fast through mine. I should
It was
really get.
great.
Anyway, so are there any other like marimba questions, or are we all good on that? I talked really fast.
I learned a lot about marimba just now. No,
So-
I've seen this class before.
Yeah, you all limitations can set you free. That is definitely true.
I like that. Put it on a t-shirt. Let's make that the Transient Canvas t-shirt.
Cool. Well, all right.
Thanks, guys. We were going to play another piece, but I think it's actually better that you all had a chance to get a lot of questions answered. So
I always think this class takes like an hour.
it doesn't.
No.
And so if for any reason you guys are feeling starved for more combinations of the sounds that we were showing you today, I would urge you to check out our YouTube channel in your free time. We have loads of recordings on there, and on our website is our repertoire page where you can click on any piece that you see and watch a video. And we've commissioned over 80 pieces, so there's just a wealth of sounds to enjoy. And with that, I guess we can yield back to the CNMF staff to close out.
Tarragon.
Yeah, Tarragon!
Yeah. Oh, someone asked me about touch harmonics.
Oh,
yeah.
okay, yeah.
You can. Yeah. They work. They work better in the low end. So if you want to, like, if I like dampen the middle of this bar, I can get harmonics to come out. But they're kind of brittle, so if you were to use them, you should only use them in very like specific settings. So,
Great. No.
cool. Awesome. Boy, yeah, great, cool. So, yeah,
That's it.
thanks for having us, boss.
Thank you guys. You guys are amazing. Everybody, let's give them a round of applause.
Yay, thank you.
Cool. All right, so I guess we see you tomorrow, right?
Yes, and we look forward to keeping up, seeing more of you guys. So thank you. Sorry, I can't talk.
Cool.
Great.
All right.
All right,
Thank
take
you,
care.
everyone.
Awesome, guys. Thank you.